According to Tom Standage, the Victorian Internet is a new communication technology that was developed to allow people to communicate almost instantly despite great distance. The Victorian Internet was established through multiple different failures, similar to the Internet. The idea of being able to communicate faster brought many new challenges and inventions that ended up setting the ball rolling for faster and more efficient communication for future users. The Victorian Internet paved the way for Internet communication to evolve into what it has evolved into today. There are many similarities between the two of them. For example, both exist for people to connect from great distances. They allow for faster communication, aid in business innovations and progress, and they are and currently still are a resource for the government. The major difference that lies between the Victorian Internet and the Internet today is their speed, the distance, and the capabilities that each hold. With the advancement of technology, the Internet today is faster, it's worldwide, and it's capable of much more than just sending messages. To understand the Victorian Internet and the Internet today, we'll be diving into the history of how it all began. The first attempts at long-distance communication was drumbeats and smoke signals. The method utilized puffs of smoke to communicate information. There was no standard code to drumbeats and smoke signals. They were often up to the sender and receiver to be able to determine what the messages were. And although drumbeats and smoke signals were just the beginning of inventions that developed the Internet today, there are many other inventions that continue to be developed that aided in the help of the Internet. The visual telegraph was finally born. It was also known as the optical telegraph, and it was created by Claude Chopp on March 2, 1791. The visual telegraph consisted of a tower with two movable arms. The arms in different positions represented a letter, a number, or a symbol, and at each tower, a person with a telescope would record what the letters, numbers, or symbols were. The towers were then built in different locations and they had a line of sight. The telegraph was the foundation for long-distance communication, and although it consisted of using a simple method of spelling letter by letter, it sparked ideas to others, and it showed the world that there were other ways to send messages much faster. Years after smoke signals were being used for long-distance communication, Alessandro Volta invented the battery. It looks much different than the batteries that we know and utilize today. It consisted of stacked layers of zinc, brine, soaked cloth, and silver. And quickly after the development of the battery, Hans Christian Ørsted discovered the magnetic field. He developed an electric current and a magnetic needle, and his findings led to more electrical inventions, which eventually brought the telegraph.
In 1820, there was a breakthrough in the field of physics, a phenomenon known as electromagnetism. Soon after this breakthrough, two new inventions, the galvanometer and the voltaic battery, would emerge to create the basis of the electric telegraph. Multiple versions were invented, but all for the same purpose. In the U.S., Samuel Morse led the way. Meanwhile, in Britain, William Cooke and Professor Charles Wheatstone were pioneering their own versions.
The visual telegraph provided communications over moderate distance, but it lacked the capabilities to connect the two halves of the world. The transatlantic cable was the game changer in the development of the Victorian Internet. It was created on August 5, 1858, by an individual named Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse. The cable line took over a year to set up, and it covered over 2,050 miles between Newfoundland and Ireland. The achievement wasn't easy. Whitehouse and his crew attempted to lay out the cable 4 times for it to function properly, and even after successfully connecting the cables, it failed a month later due to inadequate cable standards. The successful implementation of this cable led to more telegraph cables across the world, with connections to areas like Hawaii, Asia, and Australia. As successful as the cable was, there were new problems that had arose. and the cables became too congested because of information overload. And due to this problem, it sparked an invention known as the pneumatic tube. The pneumatic tube were invented to aid high congestion of messages within England, and the idea was developed by engineer Josiah Latimer Clark. The tubes were airtight and they were laid underground between telegraph stations and which were able to carry up to 5 messages at once. Through its efficiency and speed, the pneumatic tube was embraced by banks, stock markets, and business institutions that needed a quick communication. As one of the last major inventions of the Victorian Internet, it didn't come without any drawbacks, and with its rise to popularity, financial and business institutions were bombarded with forgeries, which we will touch on more later on within the presentation. The next invention that played a large part in the Internet was known as the telephone. It set the foundation for an invention that a lot of people use today, such as the smartphone, and it utilizes the wire-based electrical system such as the electrical telegraph. Although Alexander Graham Bell might have been known for inventing the telegraph, there are a few inventors that contributed to the invention as well, such as Antonio Meucci and Johann Philipp Reis. Bell's invention was originally known as a harmonic telegraph, and it was the concept that signals and sound could be sent through wires. After the telephone, there were a few more inventions until we achieved the Internet today. In 1893, Nikola Tesla was the one to demonstrate the wireless radio communication in Missouri, but it wasn't until Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi transmitted signals across the Atlantic Ocean that he proved the feasibility of the radio itself. Radio communication was typically achieved by the use of a Morse code, and it became extremely important during the First World War. It was the main communication that was used to receive and send information for military forces, along with helping journalists relay news about the war to the public. It quickly became the primary source of how people received news in the early to middle 1900s. However, once the war ended, there was a shift of how the people used radio communication, and with the increase of popularity among civilians, the radio became more of an entertainment by having radio hosts with talk shows, and the playing of music on the radio began. After the radio came the invention of the television in 1927 by Philo Farnsworth. Farnsworth used radio waves to move images to different devices. The television served as an important step in the history of the Internet because it eventually leads us to the emergence of the smart TV, which is a cross between the TV and the Internet today. The Internet as we know it today started out very different from the Victorian Internet stages to ARPANET, which is the foundation of the Internet today. In 1967, a plan for ARPANET was published, and its purpose was to share information and computer resources with educational institutes. Eventually, computers were connected, and that was the base for the Internet today. With the improvement of inventions, multiple trials and errors, and the persistence of individuals, the Internet is what it is now, and it allows us to watch movies, use social media, send emails, and do anything else that we can imagine in a matter of seconds. After all the inventions that have been sprouted throughout the centuries, the most critical step between the Victorian Internet and the Internet today is the transatlantic cable. It was a bridge that connected the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere by connecting North America to Europe. The transatlantic cable proved the foundation for the Internet today. This achievement was a crowning milestone for the Victorian Internet, and without that, the world may never have had the opportunities for a global network to flourish that it has today. The telegraph was a breakthrough for technology. Samuel F.B. Morse is the inventor that received the most credit for inventing the telegraph. However, he did not complete this breakthrough alone, and he wasn't the only to have a telegraph invention. Morse first invented the Morse code and it was done to improve the distance communication method. The previous methods were of the ancient times with smoke signals or drum beats, and they were effective for the time period, but as the world was changing, the communication methods needed to do so as well. To invent the code, the inventions from other inventors, he figured out how to put them together and create something bigger and better. Without the previous inventions, the process to improve the distance communication would have been much longer, and the first telegraph only needed a key, battery, wire, and poles for stations to communicate. Morse was in a race with other inventors to see who would be successful with the telegraph first. He received the most attention during the process and was able to receive funding to fully complete his invention. Even after the invention, it took years until the public could utilize the distance communication method, and the process could be long and tiring for any inventor. Just like the telegraph, the internet impacts communication in ways that nobody has ever experienced before. The internet would never have been able to get to the place or be invented without the telegraph breaking through these crucial barriers. Early on in the telegraph development, there was talk about how they wanted to create communication across nations. Nobody ever thought this was going to actually happen, but today we see that it indeed has. The simple idea of the telegraph shaped the way communication works, and it set a framework for communication and information process that we have today. The Victorian Internet was met with a lot of criticism at the beginning stages, and people at the time didn't want to adapt to the change. With most new technologies, concerns about security and privacy were developed, and people were using the telegraph became vulnerable to scam artists who would intercept messages and steal information. Because of these criminal people, we had to start encoding their messages before sending them off. Building those codes, the telegraph started their own jargon or speak. Businesses also benefited from the telegraph because they could gain customers across countries and make business deals via telegraphs. Romance was in the air during Victorian times, and the invention of the telegraph helped build and further romantic relations. While the telegraph may not have been as romantic as a handwritten letter, a telegraph message was a lot faster than traditional mail. Ultimately, the telegraph built the foundation for the development of modern internet technology. Sending messages at great distance was revolutionary, and at the time it made people realize that life can be easier and more convenient. Without the invention of the telegraph, today's technology might not be where it is today, and we might not even have our smartphones if it weren't for the invention. The Victorian Internet showed that there was an opportunity to grow and advance with technology and messages being sent across the country. In conclusion, the early Victorian Internet set the framework for what we have today. It connected the people to the world with the first form of communication, the telegraph. It revolutionized the communication world from the beginning. It was an era that created the idea of connecting people across the nations, and it set the framework for how our internet operates today.